Connecting now. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to see you join us today. I'm just going to check that I am okay with it being recorded. I can see Jess has just joined. Welcome, Jess. Could you pop in the chat box if you can hear me loud and clear? And I'd love to know where you're calling in from today. My name is Natasha Hawker, so please do jump in. Christina, welcome. Welcome, Danielle. Lovely to see you here. Kira's here as well, and Linda. Just jump in the chat box. Make sure I can hear you loud and clear so I can check that all of our levels are good. Jess can hear me. Jess, I'm sure you can. Okay, welcome. All right, in the interest of time, and thank you so much. I can see a few more people piling in now. I'm going to get started. I'd love you to pop in the chat box, one, that can hear me, two, where you're calling in from, and if you're comfortable, and there's no pressure here, the reason why you joined this webinar. So let me start with the reason why we're having this webinar. In the last 18 months, we have had a team member, a client, and a client's husband pass away from cancer. And you'll hear in Nikki's talk today the high number of statistics around cancer. And my brother happens to be a GP, and he predicted this with COVID because we weren't going and regularly getting our checkups where the doctors might be a little bit suspicious and look for cancer. And so they're finding it much later. So we thought this subject was really, really important. It's a very difficult area to manage. It's very sensitive. People are not comfortable with these conversations. And that's why we thought that the content that Nikki can bring to us as a community is fabulous. So let me introduce you to Nikki. But before I do that, I do have two copies to encourage you, two copies of my book, From High to Fire and Everything in Between. The first copy is for the person who is the most interactive in the chat box. And the second copy is for the person who asks us the best question. So let me tell you about Nikki. We are super lucky to have her here today. I met Nikki through when she was a judge at Telstra Best of Business Awards. She's a speaker, she's a business leader, she's an advocate. She focuses on transforming workplaces, leadership, and well-being. She's the co-host of an internationally recognized The Big C podcast. If you haven't listened to it, I'd suggest you download it now. She's also the founder of MyMuse, which we're going to hear more about today. But MyMuse is an organization that is focused on improving workplace support for employees affected by cancer, grief, and caregiving. And I think it's really important that it's both of that. She's a sought-after speaker for leaders looking to build empathetic and high-performing workplaces. I'm all for that. And she's been a keynote speaker at major corporate events, leadership conferences, and is a featured speaker at the Global HR and Wellbeing Summits. Without further ado, you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from Nikki. Welcome, Nikki, and thank you for spending the time with us today. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Natasha, and thank you everyone for joining to have a listen to this webinar. I'm going to get straight into it. It's going to be relatively short, but time for Q&A at the end. So hopefully any of you that have got questions, we can answer them. My team have been so amazing to put this presentation together. So let me know if there's anything we've missed and you want to have anything else added to it. Now, this is all about talking about some stories, talking about some case studies, and then having some actionable strategies that we can actually include as well to make sure that we've got those compassionate and supportive workplaces for people facing those serious health challenges or being a caregiver. Now, I am going to put a picture in the next slide. Just give me 1 second. Why I'm here. Now, this is a picture of myself in the Cook Islands with a person called Mike. Now, Mike was my partner. He was diagnosed with osteosarcoma at the age of 30. I was working full-time as well as being a carer for him full-time. Osteosarcoma is quite a rare cancer, especially in his age group. And so it did mean that there was a lot of uncertainty. It meant that 2.5 years after treatments, surgeries, and just a lot of hospital appointments, he was told that he was terminal and he passed away. I went through such a challenge in terms of personally, but then also with my workplace. They tried to do everything to support me from the start and gave me flexible working. This was before COVID, and it just became extremely hard. Not one printout or PDF that you could find online or within a hospital that talked about supporting you in the workplace while being a caregiver was relevant. Everything was quite outdated, but everything was also very, very generic. So it just meant that it wasn't specific to what was going on in my workplace and the way that they could support me. That was when I came up with the concept of MyMuse and brought an amazing team together. That team ended up being a team of psychologists, oncologists, HR managers, lawyers, palliative care specialists, grief specialists, to name a few. And we were able to come together and be able to put together proactive or reactive bespoke programs. So they're very, very specific to each organization. We're able to work with the company's culture, their policies, all of that kind of stuff to make it really, really specific to them. Whether it's an employee that's actually being diagnosed with a serious illness or cancer, or a caregiver, or they're wanting to create a leadership program or a manager training program to make sure that when this conversation happens, people know how to handle it. Now, it's important to understand the current landscape. I'm sure that there's many of you that are on this call that have been touched by cancer in one way or another, having a loved one that was affected, or knowing somebody, or being a caregiver yourself. However, the statistics are really scary. And when I first started MyMuse, looking at these statistics really, really shocked me. 1 in 2 Australians are diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. That's 50%. That's half the people. Imagine how many people in a workplace are actually affected by cancer themselves or by a loved one having cancer. It's a huge amount. And that number, as Natasha mentioned, is actually growing since COVID, just purely for the fact that there's a lot of people out there that haven't been getting their regular checkups, which is now meaning that when people are diagnosed with cancer, some people are being diagnosed with a much higher stage of cancer, meaning that there's not always the treatment options there, or the treatment is a lot more harsh than it would have been previously. As I said, those statistics are growing and it is extremely scary. Now, with caregivers, we've been running quite a few workshops over the past couple of weeks with some organizations, and even the caregiving statistics are really, really high. Within the workplace, 1 in 8 people is a caregiver, and that's a caregiver providing 20 hours or more of caregiving a week. Now, when we raised the question as to what people saw as being a carer, most people said parents, which is obviously one of the areas that a caregiver can be. However, there are so many others. There's a term at the moment that's being used quite a lot called sandwich carers. And sandwich carers is where you're caring for your family, your young family, but then also caring for your elderly parents. This can be really, really hard to navigate. And caring for elderly parents, whether they are living within your own home, or living in their own home, or living in a residential home, for example, there is a lot of components that are added to that. And whether it is medical appointments, whether it's so many other things that you can actually consider as being a caregiver. As well as being a sandwich carer. For myself, I am classed as a distant carer. So my parents actually live in the UK. As much as I'm not there present for every single hospital appointment, a lot of the times I might need to be on a video call or an audio call while my father is having his medical appointments. I'm a distant carer because there's certain things that I still need to be able to do. Now, that can sometimes be quite challenging, especially with a time difference. And so sometimes that is a consideration that a workplace needs to be able to consider as well. There are many other types of caregivers as well. And we've got a really, really great pack to be able to offer you at the end of this call that really, really lists some of those other caregiving responsibilities or different areas of caregiving there are. Now, the other thing to consider is the 50% of people that are working at the moment also have a chronic health condition. Now, those chronic health conditions can be anything from Parkinson's to asthma. Now, asthma was definitely one of those things that I didn't really consider a big health condition until my little boy, who's 7, had a severe asthma attack last year. Now, seeing somebody have an asthma attack is an extremely scary thing when they're grasping for air and you don't know what to do. He ended up being admitted to hospital for 6 days. And the reason for that health condition was that there was actually a situation that was going on in Sydney at the time where there was multiple amounts of people that were having a very severe asthma attack, and it was because there was a certain amount of pollen and a certain type of pollen in the air at that time. It wasn't something that was in the newspapers, it wasn't something that was in the news, but this was happening, and the hospital was full of people having asthma attacks. So when you're having those flare-ups, sometimes that can also impact those people within the workplace. And even somebody that has a very controlled asthma can have a flare-up. So those chronic health conditions can also be quite impacting to the workplace. What we want to be able to talk about is some of those challenges that are faced by employees when they have any of those things above that we've just been talking about. And they, unfortunately, as much as there's been a lot of progress that's been made in this area, there is still a stigma and a discrimination that can be caused by people that are that have one of those health conditions that we've just talked about. If you've got somebody that has taken a significant amount of time off because they had cancer and they had a lot of treatment, and then maybe they took 2 years off working, that gap in their resume, now when they're going in for that job interview, do you question them on that gap? Do they, if they are honest, how are you going to consider their honesty in that meeting? Is there that is there that fear of being perceived that they're less capable, that the cancer is going to come back? Now, these are all things that might be in the background that you don't think about straight away, but it might not be yourself that's thinking about that, but it could be somebody within your workplace that's thinking about those considerations. And this is about considering the risks within your workplace. Something that I'm going to touch on now that we found recently is that as much as there might be a HR person, there might be a manager or a C-suite within your organization that is completely comfortable having these conversations. How can you guarantee that every single person in your workplace is comfortable having these conversations? Can you mitigate that risk? Can you make sure that that is not going to be something that is going to impact your organization because somebody says something wrong or doesn't say something with enough of that support behind them? Understanding those policies, understanding those things that stand behind this person when they disclose that they have been diagnosed with cancer or that they're now a caregiver. So a lot of the things that we do and a lot of the training that we also do talks about some of those things and mitigating that risk within your workplace itself. Some of the things that people also fear is their job loss. When they disclose that they have any of those health impacts above, they fear that they are going to lose their job, and if they're not going to lose their job, it might be that they're not going to be considered for that promotion. They're not going to be considered to be put on that project because of what's going on in their home life, in their personal life. Balancing those work and health needs is extremely important. Now, there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration when somebody has something impacting their health. It's not just their medical appointments, but it's their treatment schedules and their caregiving responsibilities. Imagine somebody that's having to care for a loved one that is going through a cancer diagnosis themselves, and they need to help them with their medical appointments. But not just that, it might be picking up medication, it might be helping them with bathing, like organizing their meals for them, actually cooking their meals for them to make sure that they're eating a healthy meal. I know for myself, being a caregiver, when my late partner was diagnosed, I did absolutely everything possible to make sure that he had every single healthy meal in front of him. However, one thing that I didn't really consider during that time was my own health needs and my own needs to have healthy meals. I was making sure that he had a very nutritious dinner in hospital, but when I was in my car on the way home, I normally was eating a bag of hot chips because that was the only thing that I had time to actually put into my tummy before I needed to go back to bed. He had all the green smoothies he could possibly think of, but I was probably downing cups of coffee to make sure that I could stay awake. So sometimes if somebody is a caregiver in your workplace, it's also making sure that they're okay at the moment and that they're looking after themselves. The whole scenario that they talk about on the plane of making sure that you put your own oxygen mask on before putting your child's one on is the case when it comes to a caregiver as well. Is making sure that you look after yourself, because if you're not healthy, if you're not there to be able to look after that loved one. The last thing that we're going to touch on in this slide is the financial strain. Now, a lot of people have increased medical costs and increased medical expenses when they're going through a health crisis. With that, sometimes there is a reduction in their income because they're having to take unpaid leave, they're having to just have time off work. So those reductions in income can have such a significance. It can mean that they're not able to pay their rent or pay their mortgage. So telling an employee to take off as much time as they need might seem like it's a fantastic thing to say in the first instance, but it's also for you to consider those background implications that might have. Do they need to be financially stable? Do they need to be having that financial income that they normally have? If they do, then how can you look at maintaining that? Can they access any of their leaves that they may have accumulated, to make sure that they're able to continue to have that impact as well, continue to have that income, as well as being able to care for somebody else, etc., and things like that. Now, being diagnosed with cancer yourself compared to being a caregiver, there's some impacts there in terms of insurances as well. A caregiver isn't able to access income protection when they're a caregiver compared to somebody when they're diagnosed with cancer. So sometimes those insurances that we have with our superannuation or take out individually, or in some circumstances a workplace is able to provide, can't always help when you are a caregiver as well. Now, the next slide that we're going to talk about is some of those practical strategies within the workplace. Some of the stuff that we do is part of that leadership commitment. Now, we have worked with a number of organizations where an employee has been diagnosed with, for example, cancer, or become a caregiver to a spouse that has cancer. It has been when the C-suite have actually been able to raise their hand and personally talk about a story themselves. Whether it has been with one of our clients where a CFO actually turned around and said that they were looking after their sick wife for a number of years while she was diagnosed with cancer, that really, really helped an employee that was going through a similar circumstance at the time. But being able to have that openness of discussing health and well-being topics is extremely valuable when it comes to a workplace, just being able to have that openness coming from the top down. Having those awareness programs that are put in place. So some of those awareness programs can be anything from something that MyMuse does, to something as simple as having the Cancer Council morning tea situation, where people actually are able to have those open discussions around an awareness topic. We've all, heard about the Are You OK days and having the Are You OK cupcakes in the workplace and all of that kind of stuff. Mental health has since COVID, a 1 in 4 statistic. If you think back to that previous slide where we talked about with the 1 in 2 for cancer, that's a lot more. However, we're not having those conversations like we do with Are You OK? And that's something that does really, really need to change. Having those support networks can be really, really important as well. Now, a lot of the cancer charities do have different support networks that they have for specific different types of cancer, but having those support networks within the workplace as well can be really, really important. We've just been working with a client where they've actually introduced a buddy system. So when somebody is either diagnosed or a caregiver, they're actually buddied up with somebody that has gone through something similar. within that workplace. Now, they are an organisation that is relatively large, but is that something that you can consider having in your own workplace to really help with that peer-to-peer support? Now, it is really important to have clear policies in place. It's something that a lot of organisations do spend quite significant time over, but it's important to review those policies and make sure that they're relevant to what is going on right now. I'm sure a lot of you have reviewed your flexible work policy since COVID and after COVID. It's important to look through those flexible work policies on a regular basis, depending on what is a norm for you within your organisation. There's a lot of other policies out there as well, which I'm sure you guys are aware of, such as the carers policy. What falls under being a carer, what falls under being the carers leave policy and the personal leave policy, what falls under that? It's important to also look through some of those other policies that you have in place as well, and which ones would impact when somebody is diagnosed with cancer or a chronic illness, or being a caregiver, and know which ones those are and which ones that it's important to access, and are those available to every single person that's working within your organisation. The non-discrimination policy, like we talked about in the previous slide, is really important as well to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen in regards to health conditions and caregiving. And the confidentiality, this sits under the Privacy Act, so doesn't need to specifically be within your policies within the workplace, but when somebody discloses that they have cancer, there is a confidentiality that you need to keep, and you need to ask them specifically if it's something that they want shared amongst the rest of the people within the workplace, or even with managers and HR. So it is important. Now, the flexible work arrangements is something that a lot of us have come to really consider since COVID and after COVID, but it's really important to think about those flexible work arrangements. How can those be accommodated within your workplace? For example, if you've got a blue collar employee that normally works on a site for construction, how is that going to change if they need to go through some cancer treatment and they actually physically aren't able to operate some of that machinery on site? How are those flexible working arrangements going to happen then? Remote working can be another thing that is to consider. Some people may need to travel significantly to have some of their treatments. If that is the case, then how is that remote working going to work? One of the things to bring into consideration here is that most hospitals have the most atrocious Wi-Fi possible. So when somebody is diagnosed with cancer and an employee says that it's absolutely fine, you can work from the hospital while you're having your treatment, or your loved one's having their treatment, that's absolutely fine. But have they got either enough data on their phone, or have they got a toggle or something like that they're able to use to actually be able to access the internet while they're in the hospital? Also to remember that with some treatments, they actually are in rooms or in levels of the hospital where there is absolutely no reception whatsoever. So sometimes it's things like that to take into consideration as well, which is something that we make sure that when we're working with clients with MyMuse, that they really know those little bits of detail. Adjusting workloads can be extremely important as well. How are those workloads going to be adjusted, and when are the review periods? Are there other people in the team that are able to pick up some of those pieces of work? And are they understanding as to what's going on? Again, that's another thing that MyMuse is able to bring into effect. There's employee assistance programs as well, which is important to consider within your workplace. Who is the EAP? Now, those supports through the EAP can be quite limited, and that is where MyMuse is very different, because we are specific to cancer and caregiving, and grief and chronic illnesses. We have psychologists and counsellors that are specific to those areas, which can sometimes be extremely important in some of those cases that your employees may have. Now, that's probably all I'm going to touch on in terms of in this area. there are important things that are in the guidebook, such as the red flags to look for, which is an important thing when you're educating managers or people within the workforce to make sure that they know what to look out for when somebody isn't disclosing what's going on, but you know that there's something that is changing in terms of their presenteeism within the workplace, or even in terms of their workload, etc., and things like that. Now, just to give you some kind of practicality with this, we're just going to talk through 2 case studies. I will talk through them relatively briefly to make sure that we've got time for Q&A at the end. But one of the case studies is a client that we had that worked in a construction company. There were 60 employees that were in that construction company, and they had a lot of on-site employees. Now, one of the site managers was diagnosed with leukemia. One of the understandings to have with the leukemia that we were able to explain to the client was that your immune system gets absolutely shot at. You're not actually able to be around other people while you're going through certain treatments, etc., and things like that. So this individual, as much as they were always on site, needed to end up changing roles to mean that they were indoors and they were quite isolated, and sometimes in a hospital room. So with us being able to support that leadership team and being able to support their manager, we were able to develop that support and develop that change of role that person was able to have during that time. That involved frameworks and conversations that we were able to have. And that meant that person was able to continue working, but in a very, very different capacity, and became much more of a project manager role that they were able to do offsite, with somebody reporting into them. That was something that was able to be implemented relatively quickly, and meant that person could financially keep on paying their mortgage, which they needed to do. They then had a return to work framework that we were able to help develop with the employee. That was with constant conversations and navigation throughout their treatment and what that was going to look like after their treatment. That return to framework also had to include certain things like when that person was going in for a scan. That involved lots and lots of different aspects, and it was important for that employer to know what those considerations were. Now, that employer has had to implement a similar type of framework 3 times since. This was something that we worked on the client with a year ago, and since then, they've had 3 people that have actually been diagnosed with cancer, and they've had to implement something extremely similar since. They were able to use that same type of framework to make sure that each of those employees was supported in the same way. Having that constant support is really, really important, but having that consistent support as well. No matter who that employee is, no matter how long they've been there for, but being able to provide that support that's the same for each employee that's diagnosed. We've seen too many times that a client has thrown absolutely everything at an individual that has been diagnosed and raised lots of money, raised lots of awareness, etc., and things like that. But then when the next person's diagnosed, are you able to replicate that exact same support? It's important to have a baseline as to what you're able to provide. And then anything above and beyond that is excellent. But it's important just to consider that this isn't just going to happen once in your workplace. It's probably going to happen multiple times. Now, case study number 2 was an accounting practice that had 30 employees. It was one of the employees whose child was actually diagnosed with brain cancer. Now, this client came to us, and one of the aspects that they needed to consider was that this person needed to continue working because they weren't able to access any of those policies that they had through their insurers. The child was diagnosed with brain cancer, which meant that this employee was one of their main carers and needed to be in hospital every single time every single time that child was having not just an appointment, but treatments. And those treatments ended up being over multiple days. So it meant hospital stays for weeks at a time. Now, guided by the CEO and external HR in this case, they were able to find ways to support. We were able to provide ways for them to be able to support and a framework for them to be able to have. And because this was the first time that this had happened in their workplace that they knew about, we were able to provide that baseline that they were able to provide for this person. Now, this went on for this employee for 2 years, and they were able to provide that support for 2 years. This individual was able to access different types of leave that they had. So everything from their carers and personal leave um, to their annual leave that they were able to access as well. Um, Now, because of what was going on, it just meant that that person, when the child was returning back to school, they weren't able to return back to school on a full-time basis. So because they were returning back part-time, the individual was also able to return to work part-time as well. So those 2 days that they weren't at work, they were able to actually use their annual leave on those days to make sure that they were able to get that full-time salary package. Um, we were also able to provide the psychological support to the individual whose child was diagnosed, and that was able to be accessed within 24 hours, and it was the same therapist they were able to use throughout those 2 years. The other thing that we were able to do was provide that psychological support to other people within the organisation. A lot of people felt very affected by this. There were a lot of young parents that worked in this workplace, as well as a few people that were pregnant at the time. And they felt very, very impacted themselves because they could put themselves in that person's shoes. Um, and they were just feeling very, very just uncertain about what the future looked like. And so they were able to access that psychological support as well, which was really, really beautiful to be able to see that the company was able to provide that to everybody. Now, some of the things that we'll just talk about here very, very quickly is just some of the strategies and some of the approaches that you can put in place. So it's that whole preparation side of things. Before those initial conversations is actually gathering all that information together and being aware of all the policies that are there, but also being aware of how much leave that person has in place, etc., and things like that. So you're able to really put an action plan together quickly. Having a private setting obviously is extremely important. Make sure that it's a comfortable environment and confidential. And any of that information that's shared in that meeting is something that you're able to take away and only shared with other people if that individual approves of it. Having open-ended questions and active listening, just sitting there and actually listening to what that person needs and what that person's issue is at the time. Some of those things are just very, very normal and part of every single conversation that you have, and every difficult conversation that you have. And a collaborative problem solving is extremely important. As much as you feel that you might be able to go there with an action plan, it's important to actually have that collaboration with the person that it's involving, because there may be a lot of uncertainty. If it's a caregiving role, there's lots of times where a caregiver, there may be certain times where there isn't that much stuff that caregiver needs support with. But it could mean that in a couple of months' time, or even in a year's time, that person's caring responsibilities may increase dramatically. And how are you going to be able to ebb and flow with those different amounts of support that person might need? So just emphasizing the empathy that needs to take place, the active listening, and the confidentiality is extremely important. Now, what can be done now, as I mentioned before, is to review the policies that you have in place, but also review any cases that you've already had in your workplace. How have you gone about them? What was the baseline? What was the action plan? What was the support that you were able to provide in the workplace for those previous cases? Review those policies and the current support that you're able to provide. And then also something that we're able to offer each of the people that were on this call is an initial discussion with you to relate to the current situations that you may have or something that you could have in the future and how ready you are for that. So we're able to organize that initial free consultation with you, and that will be something that my team is able to support you with. That's the email address that you guys are able to contact. It will also be on the back of the guide that you're able to provide, that we're able to provide as well. And any questions that you've got that you want to have right now, I'm happy to take them. Natasha.
Thank you, Nikki. Wow, that was a really good session. I got so much out of that. So that was amazing. And I can see some claps coming out there. I wanted to share, while I give you a couple more minutes to put a couple of questions in the chat box. I do have a couple of questions for you, but I think the big takeaways for me were the numbers. You know, if you're thinking 1 in 2 Australians are going to suffer from cancer, and then you've got the caring numbers on top of that, then, you know, the numbers are very high. I think the surprise for me was 1 in 8 are caregivers, and often not just parents. And the other one, the sandwich carers. For me, and that's me, I'm a sandwich carer with elderly parents and still teenagers, almost, well, adults that still need caring as well. So I do have a question from Christina. Christina asks, she says, we have a large portion of our staff that are looking to, after elderly parents. It does depend on the age of the team. That is definitely increases that demographic. Is there a help shortlist of things that they can do for themselves to look after themselves? Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question, and there's definitely we do have documents that we're able to provide to our clients, and I'm sure our team can put something together as well for you guys that just really talks about some of those ways to look after yourself. It is so important to look after yourself, and Christine, it's a great question to ask. I think um, for me personally, it was being able to take everything from those small breaks throughout the day where you're able to just be with your own thoughts, which can't always happen when you're a caregiver. Um, so being able to have a friend take you out for a coffee or take you out for lunch, where you're able to just have a little bit of your normality of life, that's away from being a caregiver. Um, the other thing is to actually acknowledge that sometimes caregivers need to have some respite as well. So if they are a caregiver full time, sometimes they actually do need to have that full time time out. And there are charities out there and things like that, and organisations out there that are able to support to be able to put that into action. It does take quite a lot of planning though, so it is something that you can't just turn around and be like, oh, this weekend I want to have some time away. It does take a fair amount of planning. But also in terms of for a workplace, if somebody is a caregiver and they're taking on significant responsibilities, sometimes it's actually just being able to provide a meal box to that employee. As I mentioned before, I was spending so much time looking after another person and them eating healthy that a lot of the time the caregiver doesn't have that time. In that circumstance, and we've done this with clients, I probably wouldn't suggest a meal kit box where you still need to make the food,
Right.
but really something where the food's already done for you. Sometimes even having Uber Eats vouchers can be quite frustrating because you actually need to sit there, go onto the app and pick the food. It's like being on Netflix and trying to figure out a program to watch. So having in Sydney and I think in Melbourne as of this week, they've got a company called Dinner Ladies. Dinner Ladies is able to provide ready-made meals that sit in the fridge or the freezer. So you don't really need to do a lot. So something as simple as that can be really, really effective.
Nikki, we had sadly a girlfriend of ours that husband had cancer and passed away, and all the women in the neighborhood, and Caroline was instrumental in organizing this, did a roster, and we'd all turn up with a variety of meals that were there for her and her family. And I think you're right, the bunch of flowers, which we often sort of resort to, is not as helpful as doing meals.
One thing that we found caused a lot of stress for people as well is whose container is this? So we did it in disposable, like foil containers that she didn't have to worry about.
Washing up and returning.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Couple more questions. Christina has said, we had a friend that husband was diagnosed with a brain cancer, and we did that. We found them someone and sent them some food to be shared, which is great. So a couple of other questions I had here. Have you seen any unfair dismissal cases around carer terminations where people have, and I don't know the answer to this and I could probably look it up, but I just think it's interesting maybe where someone's suddenly performance managed or made redundant, and that's due to carer, maybe not openly, but discreetly.
Yeah, we unfortunately have had we work with a number of non-for-profit cancer charities, and unfortunately we've had to work with a number of individuals that have been dismissed unfairly. not so much working with them in terms of the legality, but re-entering the workplace. And that's for caregivers and people that have been diagnosed with cancer. Especially, there's been some circumstances where they've already been on a performance review, and that, you know, for one person, they got their cancer diagnosis, but they were on a performance review because they felt that this person wasn't performing correctly, you know, to the level that they needed to be, and that was just purely for the fact that they were exhausted because the cancer was growing in their body. And then once they were diagnosed, this person was actually terminated. And it was pretty shocking. We have our lawyers that ensure that we train people and organisations to make sure that hopefully doesn't happen. But it does, and it's really, it doesn't happen in Australia as much as it does in America. In America, there's quite a few legal battles that go on with this happening. But it has been, you know, you can even type in, there's more around the cancer unfair dismissal compared to the caregiving, but the caregiving has also been something, there's been quite a few newspaper articles out of the UK in the past year about unfair dismissals.
Another question that jumps to mind is, do you think there's a negative bias, Nikki, towards employers with elderly caring responsibilities? Because I think that people probably understand it from a cancer perspective, but not so much from a elderly caring perspective.
I think there's a lot of discrimination in the sense that people don't always fully understand the impact of being a caregiver. And we ran some, as I was talking about, we ran some workshops recently where one of the consultants that I bring in is a caregiver at the moment, and it has a mother that has severe dementia. You know, and even talking about the impacts that dementia has had has been really, really significant. And, you know, there were some things that I hadn't even considered either. And so I think sometimes when it comes to elderly parents, it can also be that they aren't just that they're elderly parents, but there may be another chronic illness that is also happening on top of that. And it can really, really, it can just be extremely hard to navigate. And for the employee that's going through it, there's so much uncertainty that's there, that a lot of that discrimination can happen because that person can't give direct answers. They can't be like, well, this is the support I need. This is, you know, how long it's going to go on for. There's just a lot of uncertainty that happens with it. And so sometimes that can be quite difficult as well to navigate for any person that's involved. Yeah.
So, Nikki, I've got one last question, and if you can just change your slide over so people can get their gift pack, because they've been brilliant and hung around right till the end. If you guys take a scan of those QR codes, you'll get a gift pack, the free downloadable resources. Last question, and then I'm going to, obviously, Christine is going to win the best book. And I think she's going to get the most interactive on the chat box too. And so I'm going to send you 2 copies of the book, and you can just gift one, Christine, to who you think needs it. The last question from Christine is, could someone use this carer policy to take teenagers to school so they can work from home every day because they do not want to drive to work? I think that's probably more a HR question. Would you say, Nikki, or do you want to have a crack at that?
Oh, it definitely would be a HR question, I would say. I think that there is that, and this is where it's really, really important to have those baselines and have those open communications within the workplace, because there are many circumstances where people are they use the different policies in their own flexible ways, and it can be really, really frustrating for a lot of other people within the organization when you see somebody that is, let's just say, taking the piss with the, you know, with certain policies and with certain carers policies. And so sometimes it is important just to be able to have those open conversations and be able to have those constant check-ins as well, where you're able to navigate those. You know, is it that teenager needs those needs to be taken to school each day because there's something going on? You know, is it something that is a short-term thing? Is it because there is there could be a mental issue that's going on at the moment, or it could be that they've got a broken leg and they can't get public transport. So what is it that is the reason that that person is doing is having that situation go on right now? If it's just because a teenager's lazy, then that's probably a different question and a different scenario. And yeah.
One last question. Does it need, for the work and support you do, which is fabulous, do you need a certain level of HR practice already in place, or can it just be anyone can reach out from any size organisation to get your help?
Absolutely, anybody can reach out. We've worked with organisations that have had a team of 3 up to, I would say, 48,000. So it can be absolutely any size whatsoever. You don't need to have internal HR or even an external HR that you work with. It is just purely for the fact that, if you're a smaller company, it tends to normally be that you've got a situation that's going on at the moment, and that's why you need our assistance and our support. However, as I've said before, this is a risk mitigation as well. Even though you may be comfortable having these conversations, or you may be comfortable having these discussions and knowing what policies are in place, can you guarantee that every other person within your organisation is going to be at the same level?
Yeah, and I can see there's psychosocial hazard risk here too, because of the way people have been treated. On that note, I'm going to close for today. I would like to thank you, Nikki, for sharing your wealth of wisdom, your personal experience too. Thank you for sharing that. I think this has been incredibly informative. I've learnt an amazing amount. Guys, you'll be able to get the recording. That'll be sent out after this. People are saying, thanks so much, Nikki. Great insights, practical guidance and case studies. Our pleasure for organising us. We really felt we needed to get this information out here. Thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous Thursday. I think it's Thursday. And take care. And I do hope that if you need help, you can get it from Nikki and her team. And I do hope in other ways you don't need her help. This is one of those ones that we would prefer you don't. Take care all, and thanks and all the best. Bye.
Thank you.